Injured bird lands on altar during Mass. Its incredible journey revealed. The old countryside church stood gracefully atop a small hill, its stone walls weathered by time, yet still exuding a quiet dignity. The stained glass windows, adorned with depictions of saints and biblical scenes, shimmered under the golden morning sun, casting colorful patterns onto the polished wooden pews. A gentle breeze carried the faint scent of blooming wildflowers through the open doors, mingling with the lingering aroma of burning incense. It was a place of solace, where the weight of the outside world seemed to dissolve into the serenity of faith. Inside, the congregation had gathered for Sunday Mass. Families sat together, their heads bowed in reverence, while elderly parishioners, who had attended this very church since their youth, whispered prayers with deep devotion. Children, dressed in their Sunday best, fidgeted slightly but remained quiet under the gentle, watchful eyes of their parents. The soft rustling of hymn book pages turning was the only sound that broke the sacred stillness before the service began. At the heart of it all stood Father Thomas, the elderly priest whose wisdom and kindness had been a guiding light for the community for decades. His presence alone inspired calm and reverence. His eyes, though aged, still held a warmth that made everyone feel as if they were personally seen and understood. As he stepped onto the altar, his voice, steady and serene, resonated through the church, beginning the Mass with a solemn yet comforting tone. The atmosphere in the church was one of deep reflection and prayer. The flickering candlelight illuminated the grand crucifix behind the altar, a symbol of faith and sacrifice that had watched over countless generations. The choir, positioned near the front, began to sing a gentle hymn, their voices harmonizing in a way that felt almost otherworldly. The melody floated through the air, filling the sacred space with a profound sense of peace. Everyone was immersed in the rituals, the murmured prayers, the rhythmic responses, the familiar gestures of devotion. There was an unspoken understanding among them, a shared connection through their faith. It was a moment of unity, of spiritual nourishment, where worries were momentarily set aside, and the soul was allowed to rest in the presence of something greater. None of them knew that in mere moments, their quiet service would be interrupted by an unexpected visitor, one that would deliver a message more powerful than any sermon, a lesson wrapped in fragile wings and divine mystery. The sacred stillness of the Sunday Mass was broken in an instant, shattering the serene atmosphere like a stone cast into a tranquil pond. The air, thick with incense and reverence, suddenly vibrated with the frantic fluttering of wings. A blur of gray and white streaked through the golden light filtering from the stained glass windows, its movements erratic, desperate, as if fleeing some unseen predator or battling against an invisible force. Gasps rippled through the congregation, their collective breath catching in unison as they watched the small creature tumble downward. It twisted midair, its body spinning uncontrollably as it fought to regain balance. Tiny feathers loosened from its wings, floated like weightless snowflakes, catching the kaleidoscope of colors cast by the stained glass before drifting gently toward the polished marble floor. Each feather seemed to hang suspended in time, glinting faintly in the sunlight, a stark contrast to the chaos unfolding above them. The bird flapped wildly, its exhaustion evident in every strained movement, until at last, with a final, faltering effort, it landed on the altar. A sharp intake of breath swept through the church. For a moment, all eyes were locked on the small creature, lying motionless upon the pristine white cloth covering the altar. A faint stain of crimson spread where its wounded wing pressed against the fabric, marring the purity of the ceremonial linen. Its fragile chest rose and fell in rapid, uneven breaths, each inhalation a testament to its struggle for survival. One wing remained slightly extended, twitching feebly, while the other tucked close to its side in what appeared to be a protective embrace. Its dark eyes, glistening with fear, darted around the vastness of the church. The towering stone walls, the vaulted ceilings adorned with intricate frescoes, the endless rows of wooden pews, all must have seemed impossibly large and alien to this fragile being. A thin silver band encircled its slender leg, catching the candlelight and glinting like a tiny beacon amidst the solemnity of the space. This simple detail hinted at a life beyond the confines of the church, a life interrupted, perhaps even altered forever, by this unexpected detour. The church, moments before filled with sacred chants and whispered prayers, now stood frozen in collective shock. The choir, still holding their sheet music, had stopped singing altogether. Their hymn, once filling the air with harmony, now lay abandoned, unfinished. Pages of music rustled quietly in their hands as they leaned forward in astonishment, unable to tear their gaze away from the scene unfolding before them. Gasps and murmurs broke out among the congregation. Some parishioners, startled by the sudden intrusion, leaned toward one another, whispering in hushed tones. Others sat rigid, as if afraid any movement might startle the bird further. An elderly woman in the front pew, her hands clasped tightly over her rosary, made the sign of the cross and whispered a quiet prayer under her breath. Her lips moved silently, her face etched with concern and compassion. A few children, unafraid and full of curiosity, craned their necks, trying to get a better look at the injured creature. Their wide-eyed wonder stood in stark contrast to the unease radiating from many adults. Parents, uncertain of how to react, gently pulled their children back, unsure whether this moment was one of reverence or disruption. The tension in the room was palpable, a mixture of awe, confusion, and a shared sense of witnessing something extraordinary. Even the candles, flickering softly in their golden holders, seemed to burn a little quieter, as though the very elements themselves were holding their breath. The silence that blanketed the church was heavy yet profound, charged with an unspoken understanding that this was no ordinary event. It was as if the universe itself had paused to observe the fragile drama playing out on the altar. And then the priest moved. Father Thomas stood in front of the altar, his chasuble catching the soft light streaming through the stained glass windows. His face, lined with wisdom and years of devotion, remained composed despite the commotion. He did not startle, nor did he rush forward in alarm. Instead, he observed the trembling creature with the same quiet reverence with which he handled the sacred chalice during the Eucharist. There was a calm authority in his demeanor, a quiet confidence that reassured those watching him. For a moment, he did nothing. He simply stood there, allowing the silence to settle over the congregation. He could feel the tension in the room, the way the parishioners held their collective breath, waiting to see what he would do next. But in his heart, Father Thomas knew this was no ordinary event. This was not merely a bird seeking refuge. It was a moment imbued with meaning, though the exact nature of that meaning remained elusive. Slowly, deliberately, he stepped forward. His sandaled feet made a soft, measured sound against the marble floor, each step echoing through the hushed church. There was something careful, almost sacred, about the way he approached the small creature, as if he were stepping into a moment far greater than himself. His movements were deliberate, unhurried, as though he understood instinctively that haste would only exacerbate the bird's distress. The bird tensed as his shadow fell over it, its tiny claws curling against the altar cloth. It flinched, as if expecting harm. But Father Thomas did not reach quickly or forcefully. Instead, he extended his hands with patience and care, palms open, his fingers curved gently, as if cradling the very air itself. His touch was reverent, almost ceremonial, as though he were handling something holy rather than a mere animal. And then he touched it. The moment his weathered hands came in contact with the fragile being, a hush seemed to deepen over the church. The bird, which had fought so desperately moments before, did not flee. It did not struggle. It simply stilled. The trembling in its body lessened, though it did not completely disappear. Its rapid breaths slowed just slightly, as though it could sense that, in these hands, it was safe. Father Thomas lifted the bird carefully, cupping it in his palms as though it were the most delicate thing in the world. The warmth of his touch met the frailty of its feathers, and for the first time, the creature did not resist. Its dark eyes, once filled with panic, now gazed up at him with a mixture of trust and resignation. His keen eyes took in the wound. Dried blood crusted against the soft down of its wing, the signs of exhaustion written in every fiber of its being. This bird had flown beyond its limits. It had fought against something larger than itself, and yet, despite it all, It had found its way here, to this church, to this altar, to these hands. The priest lowered his gaze, his lips moving in a whispered prayer. His voice, too soft for the congregation to hear, carried only between himself and God. The words were simple yet profound, a plea for healing and protection, a reminder of the interconnectedness of all living things. As he prayed, the congregation watched in silent awe, their own hearts stirred by the sight before them. To some it was just a bird, an accident, an odd event, a simple creature caught in an unfortunate circumstance. But to others, to those who looked just a little deeper, this moment felt like something else, something divine. A message perhaps, a sign. Somewhere in the back pews, a man who had not prayed in years found his fingers tightening around the cross he wore beneath his shirt. A woman who had nearly lost her faith felt something stir in her chest, something she could not quite name but recognized as hope. Even the skeptics, those who had long distanced themselves from belief in miracles, found themselves questioning. Because what were the chances? What were the chances that, of all places, in all the vast sky, this wounded creature had found its way here? That it had fallen not onto the hard, unfeeling ground, but upon the very altar of God. The sunlight streaming through the stained glass windows shifted as the morning passed, casting shifting hues across the altar. Reds, blues, and golds danced upon Father Thomas's robes, upon the delicate feathers of the injured bird, and upon the faces of the congregation. For the first time that morning, they were not thinking of their daily troubles. They were not thinking of their schedules, their worries, their burdens. They were thinking only of this, the tiny wounded bird, the priest's gentle hands, the inexplicable feeling that something greater was at work. And in that holy silence, even the most skeptical hearts began to wonder if they were witnessing something extraordinary. The silence in the church lingered, thick with reverence and unspoken questions. It was a quiet so profound that it seemed to echo through the vaulted ceilings, amplifying the weight of the moment. The small bird cradled in Father Thomas's gentle hands had ceased its frantic movements. Its trembling had subsided, replaced by a fragile stillness. Its tiny chest rose and fell in slow, uneven breaths, as though drawing strength from the warmth of the priest's touch. Father Thomas gazed down at the delicate creature, his eyes soft with contemplation. Then, raising his gaze to meet the congregation, he let out a quiet sigh, a sound not of exhaustion, but of understanding. Still holding the bird with great care, he stepped forward, his voice calm yet resonant, cutting through the hushed stillness like a whisper carried on the wind.
"My brothers and sisters,"
he began, his voice carrying through the vast expanse of the church.
"this little one has come to us in the most unexpected of ways. And yet, is it truly unexpected, or has it been guided here?"
The congregation remained silent, their attention riveted on the priest. His words hung in the air, inviting reflection, stirring something deep within each listener.
"Look at how small it is,"
he continued, tilting his hand slightly so all could see.
"So delicate, so wounded, and yet it lives, it breathes. It has endured something great to find its way here."
A few people nodded subtly, their expressions shifting from astonishment to thoughtfulness. They studied the bird with renewed curiosity, as if seeing it for the first time, not just as an injured creature, but as a symbol of resilience and divine providence.
"This is no ordinary moment,"
Father Thomas said, his tone imbued with certainty.
"We are told in the scriptures that not even a sparrow falls to the ground outside of God's care. And if the Lord watches over the smallest of birds, how much more does he watch over each of us?"
A murmur rippled through the crowd, quiet yet charged with emotion. Some glanced at the bird again, their eyes filled with wonder. Others bowed their heads, lost in thought, perhaps recalling moments in their own lives when they had felt overlooked or abandoned, only to realize later that they were being carried by forces beyond their understanding. Father Thomas smiled faintly, sensing their hearts opening to the message he sought to convey.
"And so I ask you, my dear friends, what has brought this bird here? What lesson does it carry for us today?"
He paused, allowing the question to settle in the air like incense smoke curling upward. Each person sat quietly, searching their own hearts for an answer. Some closed their eyes while others exchanged glances with loved ones beside them. Then after a moment, Father Thomas continued.
I do not know this bird's past,
He admitted, his voice tinged with humility.
but I can imagine it. I can see it once soaring high, full of life and purpose. Perhaps it lived without fear, trusting the wind to carry it wherever it needed to go.
The congregation listened intently, drawn into the story he wove before them. His words painted vivid images in their minds. The bird gliding effortlessly above treetops, wings slicing through crisp morning air, free and unburdened.
But then
Father Thomas said, his voice lowering.
came the storm.
He paused, letting the word resonate.
The winds rose, howling with fury. The rain fell in torrents, turning the sky into a veil of darkness. This small creature, no matter how strong its wings had been before, found itself battered, tossed about like a leaf in a hurricane.
A few people shivered involuntarily, imagining the terror of such a struggle. The relentless assault of nature, the disorienting chaos, the sheer helplessness of being caught in something far greater than oneself.
And then it was struck down,
Father Thomas continued, his voice heavy with empathy.
perhaps by the force of the wind, perhaps by something unseen, a branch, a predator, or simply the sheer exhaustion of fighting against the storm. Whatever it was, it left this bird wounded, weak, lost.
The church was utterly still, the silence broken only by the faint rustle of fabric as someone shifted uncomfortably in their pew.
But
Father Thomas said, his voice growing warmer.
it did not give up.
A flicker of understanding passed over the faces in the crowd. Heads lifted slightly, eyes brightened, as if a spark of hope had been reignited within them.
Despite the pain, despite its broken wing, despite not knowing where it was going, it kept flying. It searched, even as its strength faded. It did not surrender to the storm.
A deep silence followed his words, pregnant with meaning. Then, in a tone filled with quiet awe, he said,
And now it has found itself here, in this sacred place, in the house of God.
Father Thomas let his gaze sweep across the church, meeting the eyes of those before him. There was a mother clutching her child's hand, a young man staring intently at the altar, an elderly couple leaning into one another for support. Each face bore its own story, its own scars.
My friends,
He said gently.
is this not also the story of our own lives?
Heads bowed in quiet recognition. Some nodded slowly, while others pressed their lips together, fighting back tears.
How often do we too fly freely in life, believing we are strong, believing we are in control?
He continued.
How often do we set out on our own paths, feeling certain of our direction?
Several parishioners nodded, their expressions shifting to reflection. They remembered times when they had felt invincible, convinced that they could navigate life's challenges without faltering.
And then
Father Thomas said softly.
the storm comes.
His words carried weight, settling heavily in the hearts of those who heard them.
The winds of hardship,
He continued.
the downpour of suffering, the unexpected struggles, the illness, the loss, the betrayal, the doubt.
A woman in the middle pew swallowed hard, her fingers gripping her rosary tightly. An elderly man wiped his eyes discreetly with the sleeve of his jacket.
And when we are struck down, we feel weak, wounded, lost.
Father Thomas said, his voice filled with compassion.
We wonder if we will ever find refuge again. We wonder if we have the strength to keep going.
He looked down at the bird once more, still resting in his hands.
But just like this creature, we are not meant to give up. We are meant to keep going, even when we do not see the path ahead. We must trust that no matter how lost we feel, we are never truly alone. We must believe that even in our weakest moments, God is guiding us home.
The church remained utterly silent, but within that silence, something profound stirred. A flickering candle cast a soft glow upon the altar, illuminating the bird's fragile frame. The sunlight, shifting through the stained glass, painted brilliant colors across the priest's hands. And in that moment, It was as if heaven itself was nodding in agreement. Father Thomas took a deep breath and let his final words settle into the hearts of those before him.
We are all like this bird, my dear friends. We have all faced storms, moments when the winds of life seem to push us in every direction but forward. We have all felt lost, as if the world has become too heavy, too confusing to navigate. There are times when the skies grow dark and we question whether we will ever see the light again. But, like the bird, if we keep flying, if we keep believing in our own strength, in the whispers of hope that call us forward, we will find ourselves where we are meant to be. Through every challenge, through every difficulty, we grow. The storms we face are not punishments. They are part of the journey. Each gust, each turbulent wind carries within it a lesson, a chance to spread our wings wider, to discover that we are capable of far more than we ever imagined. Yes, we may stumble, we may fall, but the key is never to stop moving forward. The key is to trust in the journey, to trust in the winds that, even though they may push us, also guide us to new horizons.
A long pause followed. Then one by one, the people in the congregation closed their eyes in silent prayer. Some whispered words of gratitude. Others let silent tears fall, their cheeks glistening in the dappled light. For in the journey of the smallest bird, they had seen a reflection of their own souls, and in its perseverance, they had found renewed faith. As the service resumed, the bird remained cradled in Father Thomas's hands, a living testament to the power of endurance and divine guidance. Outside, the world continued its ceaseless march, but inside the church, hearts had been touched and transformed by the simple act of a wounded bird finding sanctuary on the altar of God. The church remained enveloped in silence, the weight of Father Thomas's words lingering in the air. The bird, though small and fragile, had become more than just an injured creature. It had become a symbol, a living message that had touched the hearts of all present. Father Thomas looked down at the tiny being in his hands, then back at his congregation. He could see the reflection of something deep in their eyes. Some held wonder, others held tears. But in all of them, he saw the flicker of something that had not been there before: understanding.
This bird did not know where it was going.
Father Thomas said softly, his voice filled with gentle conviction.
It did not choose to land on this altar. It simply followed its instinct, to keep going, to keep searching for refuge, even in its moment of greatest weakness.
He paused, letting the significance of his words settle into the hearts of his listeners.
And yet here it is,
He continued, lifting the small bird slightly.
not in the cold, not alone in the wilderness, not abandoned, but here, in the house of God.
The quiet was absolute. No one stirred, no one whispered. It was as if time itself had stilled to allow these words to sink in.
My brothers and sisters,
Father Thomas said, his eyes sweeping across the pews.
are we so different from this bird?
A young woman in the back, who had been struggling with doubts in her faith, wiped a silent tear from her cheek. An elderly man, burdened with grief he had not spoken of in years, exhaled slowly, as if something within him was loosening.
How often do we feel lost?
Father Thomas continued.
How often do we wander, broken and uncertain, feeling as though we are alone? How often do we believe that our suffering has no meaning, that our struggles are without purpose?
A murmur ran through the crowd, almost imperceptible, as people exchanged glances or bowed their heads in quiet reflection.
But faith,
The priest said, his voice steady.
faith does not mean a life without suffering. It does not mean that we will never face storms or hardships. Faith means trusting that even in the storm, even in the darkness, even in our weakest moments, we are still being led.
He stepped forward, his sandals making the faintest sound against the marble floor.
This bird did not understand where it was going. It did not know that this altar awaited it. And yet, it arrived.
A young boy sitting in the front pew, no older than 10, gazed up at the bird with wide eyes as though seeing something miraculous.
And so it is with us.
Father Thomas said.
We may not always see the path. We may not always understand why we are being led through difficulty, through trials, through sorrow. But if we trust, if we continue forward, we will find that we are never truly abandoned. We will find that we have always been guided.
Father Thomas gently stroked the bird's soft feathers, his movements slow and careful. The tiny creature no longer trembled, as though it too understood that it had found a place of safety.
This bird endured.
He said, his voice carrying through the church.
Though weak, though wounded, it did not give up. It fought against the storm, against pain, against exhaustion. And because of that, it reached a place where it could rest, where it could heal.
He looked up, his gaze filled with warmth.
And what is it that sustains us when we feel like giving up?
The answer came, not from words, but from the expressions of those before him. He saw it in the bowed heads, in the clasped hands, in the quiet reverence of those who had been touched by this moment.
It is prayer.
He said simply. A woman in the middle pew who had not prayed in years suddenly felt the urge to fold her hands.
It is trust.
Father Thomas continued.
It is believing that we are seen, even when we feel invisible. It is knowing that we are loved, even when we feel unworthy.
He let his gaze move across the room, resting briefly on each soul before him.
How many of you have felt like this bird?
He asked gently.
How many of you have felt tired, wounded, unsure if you had the strength to keep going?
A few people nodded. Others closed their eyes, acknowledging the quiet truth of his words.
This is why we pray.
Father Thomas said.
Not because prayer removes all hardship, but because prayer gives us the strength to endure it. Because when we place our trust in God, we are carried, even when we cannot see it.
He turned his attention once more to the bird.
And so I ask you,
He said, his voice softer now, almost reverent.
Do you believe that this moment is an accident?
No one spoke.
Do you believe that of all the places this small creature could have fallen, it just happened to land here, on this altar, in the middle of our worship?
People shifted in their seats, glancing at one another. It was an impossible coincidence.
I do not.
Father Thomas said firmly.
I do not believe in accidents when it comes to God's will.
A woman in the third row, who had been silently battling doubt, felt something stir within her heart.
Perhaps,
The priest continued,
this bird was sent to remind us of something we had forgotten. Perhaps it was sent because someone here needed to see it.
He scanned the room slowly.
Maybe someone here has been struggling, wondering if God sees their pain. Maybe someone here has felt like giving up, like their prayers have gone unheard. Maybe someone here has been waiting for a sign.
The weight of his words settled heavily in the air.
If that is you,
Father Thomas said gently.
then I tell you now, this is your sign. This is your reminder that God sees you, that He has not forgotten you, that even in your pain, even in your struggle, you are being guided.
A single sob escaped from the back of the church. No one turned to see where it had come from, but the emotion was felt by all.
This bird has suffered, but it has also survived.
Father Thomas said, his voice filled with certainty.
And so will you.
He looked down at the small creature once more, his lips moving in a silent prayer. Then, lifting his gaze to the congregation, he said,
Let this be a lesson for all of us. No matter how lost we feel, we are never truly lost. No matter how broken we are never beyond healing. No matter how dark the storm, the light of God will always lead us home.
A hush fell over the church. Then slowly, one by one, people bowed their heads. Some whispered prayers of gratitude. Others let quiet tears fall. For in the presence of this small, injured bird, they had seen the undeniable presence of God. As Father Thomas concluded his reflection, the church remained enveloped in a profound silence. It was not an empty quiet, but one brimming with emotion, as though every heart in the congregation had been laid bare. The priest's words lingered in the air, resonating deeply with those who sat before him. He paused for a moment, allowing the weight of what he had shared to settle fully into their souls. Then, with a gentle smile, he extended an invitation.
Let us take a moment.
He said softly, his voice like a balm to weary spirits.
Let us reflect on our own journeys, the storms we have faced, the wounds we carry, and the hope that still burns within us.
With these words, the entire congregation bowed their heads in prayer. Some closed their eyes tightly, while others clasped their hands together, gripping rosaries or tissues dampened by tears. A few children, sensing the solemnity of the moment, mimicked the adults around them, folding their small hands in imitation of reverence. The atmosphere was heavy with emotion. Tears streamed down faces unbidden, yet they were not tears of despair. Rather, they were tears of release, of gratitude, of recognition. Many parishioners recalled moments in their lives when they had felt lost, broken, or abandoned. Times when the storms of hardship seemed insurmountable. But now in this sacred space, surrounded by the warmth of community, in the presence of something greater, they found solace. They realized that just like the bird, they too had endured more than they thought possible. Father Thomas stood silently at the altar, his hands still cradling the fragile creature. His expression was serene, almost reverent, as if he understood that this moment transcended the boundaries of ordinary experience. This was not merely a mass interrupted by an injured bird. It was a divine encounter, a reminder of God's unwavering care for even the smallest among his creations. When the moment of silent prayer ended, Father Thomas raised his head and looked out over the congregation. There was no need for further explanation. The message had already taken root in their hearts. After the reflective pause, Father Thomas carefully carried the bird to a nearby windowsill, where sunlight poured in through the stained glass, casting vibrant hues across the marble floor. He placed it gently on a soft cloth he retrieved from the sacristy, ensuring it was comfortable and safe. The window was slightly ajar, allowing fresh air to flow in, a gentle breeze that seemed to whisper promises of healing and renewal. As the Mass resumed, the congregation continued participating in the liturgy, though their focus occasionally drifted back to the small bird resting near the window. Throughout the readings and hymns, the bird remained still, its tiny body rising and falling with each labored breath. Its chest moved rhythmically, almost as if it were keeping time with the cadence of the prayers being offered. The congregation couldn't help but notice how fragile it looked against the vibrant backdrop of sunlight streaming through the stained glass. Each ray of light illuminated the delicate texture of its feathers, which shimmered faintly despite their disheveled state. Yet even in its vulnerability, there was a kind of beauty, a testament to life's tenacity. Yet as the service progressed, there was a subtle change in the bird's demeanor. Its trembling, once so pronounced and heart-wrenching, had subsided. Its dark eyes, which had darted about in panic when it first landed on the altar, no longer reflected fear. Instead, they appeared calm, almost serene, as though the creature sensed it was safe within this sacred space. It wasn't just the physical environment, the warmth of the sunlight, the softness of the cloth, that seemed to comfort the bird. It was something more intangible. Perhaps it was the collective energy of the congregation, united in prayer and compassion, or perhaps it was the spiritual aura of the church itself. Whatever the source, the bird appeared to be drawing strength from it, resting not merely in body but also in spirit. By the time the final blessing was given, something remarkable began to happen. The bird stirred, shifting slightly on the cloth. Its uninjured wing twitched, then stretched ever so cautiously. A collective gasp rippled through the congregation as they watched the creature attempt to move. Slowly, tentatively, it spread both wings, not fully, but enough to test their strength. Then, in a moment that felt nothing short of miraculous, the bird fluttered its wings. At first, the movements were weak and uneven, but with each successive beat, they grew stronger. The congregation held their breath, unwilling to miss a single detail of this unfolding wonder. Finally, with a burst of energy that seemed impossible given its earlier state, the bird lifted itself into the air. It hovered uncertainly for a moment, as if testing its newfound freedom, before gliding gracefully toward the open window. For a brief second, it perched on the sill, turning its head to look back at the church interior. Then, with a final flap of its wings, it soared outward into the bright morning light, disappearing into the vast sky beyond. The church erupted into spontaneous applause, followed by murmurs of amazement and gratitude. Some wiped away tears, while others crossed themselves in awe. The sight of the bird taking flight was more than just a natural recovery. It was a symbol of hope, resilience, and divine intervention. It was as if the heavens themselves had answered their prayers, sending a tangible sign that no matter how dire the circumstances, restoration was always possible. As the congregation filed out of the church after the service, the mood was markedly different from when they had entered. Gone was the heaviness of worry and doubt that many had carried with them. In its place was a palpable sense of renewal, a quiet confidence that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them with faith and perseverance. People lingered in the courtyard outside the church, reluctant to leave the scene of such a transformative experience. Some whispered to one another about how profoundly the moment had touched them personally,
I've been feeling so lost lately,
confessed a young woman to her friend, her voice trembling with emotion.
but watching that bird fight its way back, it reminded me that I'm stronger than I think, that God hasn't forgotten me.
An older man nodded in agreement, his eyes glistening.
I came here today carrying a lot of pain,
He admitted.
but seeing that little bird rise again, it gave me hope. Maybe my storm will pass too.
Others spoke of how the bird's journey mirrored their own struggles. A mother battling illness, a teenager grappling with self-doubt, a couple navigating the challenges of marriage. Each person found a piece of their story reflected in the bird's resilience, and in doing so, they discovered a renewed trust in God's plan. Even those who had entered the church skeptical or indifferent left with a changed perspective. One man who rarely attended Mass remarked to his wife as they walked to their car,
You know, I didn't expect to get anything out of today, but that bird, it made me realize I've been giving up too easily. I need to keep fighting for my family, for myself.
For the children present, the event became a cherished memory they would recount for years to come.
Did you see it fly away?
One little boy asked excitedly, tugging at his father's sleeve.
It was like magic.
His father smiled, ruffling the boy's hair.
Not magic,
He replied gently.
something even better. Faith.
As the crowd dispersed, the impact of the morning's events lingered. The image of the bird taking flight remained etched in their minds, a vivid reminder that even in their darkest moments, they were never truly alone. Like the bird, they could find strength in vulnerability, courage in uncertainty, and hope in the promise of divine guidance. Back inside the church, Father Thomas stood by the altar, gazing at the spot where the bird had landed hours earlier. He smiled faintly, his heart swelling with gratitude. Though he had witnessed countless miracles throughout his ministry, this one felt particularly special. It was a testament to the enduring power of faith, a lesson delivered not through grand gestures, but through the humblest of messengers. And so, as the sun climbed higher in the sky, casting golden light over the town, the congregation carried with them not only the memory of a wounded bird, but also a renewed conviction that no matter the storms they faced, they would find their way home, to peace, to purpose, and to God.